Well, welcome back to the course, African Political Thought. After the midterm break, I hope that you had a very profitable time working on your readings, working on your essays, and that you're raring to go again for the second part of the term and the second part of this lecture series. I'm going to talk today about Robert Mugabe and what his legacy might be, particularly in thoughtful terms. And this is a difficult lecture because of two reasons. The first is that the reputation of Mugabe, particularly in the West, is of an authoritarian person without thought, without rationality, whose precipitate actions basically melted down his country in economic terms. And I want to contest that to a certain degree, not entirely, because it's quite clear from the economic state of Zimbabwe today that a terrible decline has taken place. And this decline is very much part of the legacy of Robert Mugabe, who died in 2019 after having been deposed from power by his own army in 2017. He has been leading the country since 1980, and you can really trace the precipitate decline from 2000 when he preemptorily began a land nationalization program, which was essentially a seizure of farmlands without a plan as to how to keep those farmlands productive. And I want to make this point at the very, very beginning because the Zimbabwean economic miracle, as it was sometimes called, was not built on agriculture as a peasant enterprise. It was built on exporting food to Western supermarkets. You went down to Sainsbury's, Tesco's, your beans came from Zimbabwe. You went to buy tulips, they were actually farmed in Zimbabwe, even though they were auctioned in Amsterdam. And so it was this kind of agriculture for export that brought in commercial revenues from commercial farms using commercial agricultural, agri-tech, agri-industrial methodologies. All of that was lost because of a lack of planning in the aftermath of the land seizures from 2000 onwards. There is therefore a question which needs to be asked, and that is to do with how was Zimbabwe up to the year 2000 from 1980 onwards. The second reason why this is a difficult lecture is because of my own close association with Zimbabwe, being very, very much part and parcel of the country's development, the process of its independence, and to this day, I remain very, very much a figure who's in the public news in Zimbabwe because of my comments on the direction of the government, the direction of the opposition. So trying to keep my views objective, as I do try to do in my commentaries on the country, I'm sparing neither of the government nor of the opposition. I'll try to call the shots as I see them. But even so, it's very, very clear, particularly, and you'll see this over a 1 hour lecture, that I'm heavily invested in the country. So I thought in preparing today's lecture, I'll just run with being heavily invested in the country and talk in the first place in a personal sense. Now, you can disaggregate this personal sense from your own readings on Zimbabwe. And the books I've written try to be as objective and as depersonalized as possible. And those of you who just wanted to have a quick summary of the history of Zimbabwe, particularly underneath Robert Mugabe, and this is on the BLE page, can access my 3-page Guardian obituary on Robert Mugabe, which was published immediately after his death. I hasten to add that these obituaries are written well in advance and they're updated on a regular basis, so that when somebody suddenly dies, the newspaper can spring into action, and it appears as if those 3 pages were manufactured by magic. In fact, a very great deal of editorial preparation, constant revision has gone into these things. But beginning on that kind of personal note, it really began, I guess, in 1969, when after an anti-Vietnam War protest, we occupied the American consulate in Auckland, New Zealand, and I was in prison. The person in the next cell was a Rhodesian refugee, Rhodesia being the earlier name for what is now Zimbabwe. He was there on a scholarship that the students of New Zealand had raised because the government certainly wasn't giving scholarships. And he'd come to join the anti-Vietnam demonstration. And so exchanging, as it were, conversation across the prison corridor from the grills in our cell doors, he began to talk to me about Zimbabwe and what he hoped would happen after the country became free. Because the country wasn't free. It was one of these creations of corporate colonialism led by Cecil Rhodes, reaching out from South Africa through to southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, into northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, and also what was called Nyasaland, now Malawi. And these were the three focal points of the great corporate colonial adventurism of Cecil Rhodes. And there was a very large settler population in South Africa, of course, but also in southern Rhodesia. And it became clear as the 60s began to dawn that Africa, including southern Africa, was moving towards an era of decolonization. The British Prime Minister made the amazing step of flying to Cape Town and addressing the apartheid South African Parliament in 1962, saying that the wind of change was about to sweep Africa, and trying to encourage the apartheid legislators to look afresh at their determination to maintain a regime of racial discrimination. Although it was one of the great political speeches of the mid-20th century, it had no effect whatsoever on the South African government. But it made them and neighboring southern Rhodesia dig their heels in, so that in 1964, when northern Rhodesia became independent as Zambia, underneath Kenneth Kaunda, whose work we've discussed in a previous lecture, the reaction in southern Rhodesia was, well, not us. We're not going to accept majority rule underneath a black government, or at least a black majority government, even if white legislators and ministers are included in a majority black government. And so they declared, led by Ian Smith, the leader of the Rhodesia Front Party, that never in 1,000 years would majority rule come to their country. And so in 1965, 1 year after Zambia's independence, the white settler regime made a unilateral declaration of independence. They were going to refuse the determination of the British Crown to decolonize. They were going to go it alone. They had a powerful ally in apartheid South Africa who basically wanted to have a buffer state between themselves and the encroachment of black majority rule, and southern Rhodesia was perfect for that. And so, notwithstanding sanctions, blockades, goods could still come in through South Africa, and the Rhodesians fielded a formidable army. They were prepared to resist any attempt to overthrow their illegal, their outlaw regime. The British government was basically feeling powerless to stop this. They condemned it, of course. They imposed economic sanctions. But at that particular time, in the mid-1960s, the Labour government of Great Britain, underneath Harold Wilson, was going through one of those economic cycles of doom, gloom, despair. Britain never seems to get out of this cyclical process. And the economy was in such a powerless state that it was felt that they could not take military action. there was actually a plan drawn up for the invasion of White Rhodesia by Field Marshal Lord Carver, but the expense involved was so great that Harold Wilson shirked shy of implementing it, which meant that if you were going to have a military option and economic options such as sanctions were clearly not working, then that military option had to be exercised by the black majority themselves, which basically meant that the declaration of unilateral independence set the stage for armed rebellion. Now, even so, it didn't need to lead immediately to armed rebellion. If the White Rhodesian government had, for instance, tried to make some room for the nationalist trade union-based movement led by Joshua Nkomo. Nkomo had a heartland in the western part of the country, Matabeleland North, Matabeleland South. He was recognized as the leader of the Ndebele people who lived there, and he basically had, let us say, very traditional European-based ideas on what a just rebellion should be like. It should be worker-based. The working class, insofar as manual labor was concerned in the cities, was black. So he thought that this was the way to agitate, at least for a greater share of rights and government positionalities for the black majority. But he was repudiated. He was basically outlawed. He took exile in Zambia. And it meant that the choices involved for other nationalists were a contemplation of, okay, we can't do this through trade union rights. We're going to have to do this by militarized action. So when Robert Mugabe, who was not yet the leading member, but a leading member of a rival nationalist movement to that of Joshua Nkomo, when he was imprisoned in 1964, and he was imprisoned for 10 years, he had a lot of time to contemplate how best to enforce a black majority rule in Rhodesia. He had an interesting formation in prison. He had already gone to Fort Hare University in South Africa. That was a religious institution where there was no racial discrimination in terms of restrictions on black students studying. Nelson Mandela went there, for instance. Mugabe followed shortly after Mandela. And he'd gone on to Ghana, where he also took another degree, qualified as a teacher, married his first wife, Sally. But it was in prison that, since he had undergraduate qualifications, he could enroll in distance education. In those days, it certainly wasn't done by screen, it was done by correspondence. But he earned several master's degrees from the University of South Africa and the University of London, at that stage probably the two most advanced universities in the world in terms of distance education. The University of South Africa offered degrees to anyone in the world because you didn't have to mix black and white people in the same classroom. It was all done by distance. And as for the University of London, well, Mugabe was given tuition by professors from the LSE and from SOAS. He took, I think, 3 master's degrees in the end during his prison years. As with Nelson Mandela and the ANC prisoners on Robben Island, a University of the Cells was established among the nationalists in prison in Rhodesia, and Mugabe was one of the lecturers. So after he'd served his 10-year term which basically included moments of great bitterness as well as reflection, because his son died while he was in prison and he was refused compassionate leave to attend the funeral even for one day. And that burdened him for quite some years afterwards, if not until the end of his days. But basically when he was released in 1974, he immediately took exile in Zambia. The Zambians were very suspicious of him because they were hosting Joshua Nkomo's wing of the liberation movement. They were also very suspicious of him in the sense that he was coming to be recognized as the leader of the alternative nationalist wing. And he was regarded as a maverick, as an unguided missile. And Kaunda, of course, was trying to steer one of these very uneasy paths of hosting liberation movements while pretending to be pacific, preparing his army while never giving the order to fight back. One of those tightropes that we've discussed. And he was very concerned that the presence of Mugabe would completely destabilize this international diplomatic tightrope act. So he imprisoned Mugabe himself, and of course this immediately resulted in great embarrassment. So he arranged for Mugabe to escape to Mozambique. This was in 1974. Mozambique had just become independent because of a military uprising in Portugal. The president of Mozambique, Samora Machel, promptly imprisoned Mugabe himself because there were already militarized leaders of his liberation faction, ZANU, in Mozambique preparing to organize a military response to the Rhodesian Front's white minority rule. And he thought that Mugabe, again, would be an unpredictable, unguided missile, one volatile addition to an already volatile mix, and so restrained Mugabe, first of all by imprisoning him, and then afterwards restricting his movements. But Mugabe, by quite ruthless and adroit maneuvers, overcame the military leaders of the liberation movement, already then gathering in Mozambique, took it over and became the acknowledged leader of ZANU. And basically, from the mid-1970s, you had the beginnings of full-scale military resistance to white rule. Mugabe's people were Chinese trained, and Nkomo's were Soviet trained. The Cold War, as we knew it in Europe, had come as a hot war to Africa. Proxy wars, perhaps, but definitely hot. And the ZANU, Mugabe-affiliated fighters, were trained in Mozambique and in Tanzania by Chinese trainers. Not that they knew very much about the Rhodesian landscape, not that they knew very much about Rhodesian military response times, so that it has to be said that the very first incursions of Mugabe's guerrillas into Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, were experiments, basically, where young fighters, very young fighters, sometimes just people who had left secondary school to join the guerrillas. These were incursions where the young fighters were used as cannon fodder, basically to see how fast the Rhodesians could respond, and they could respond very swiftly and very ruthlessly. And they had helicopters as well as all kinds of other powerful armaments, and a very sophisticated deployment of what they called joint operational commands and sub-joint operational commands throughout the country. In other words, they could mobilize in an instant. They could reinforce their positions in an instant, and they patrolled on a completely ruthless basis. Towards the end, they were probably augmented also by mercenaries, including veterans from American fighting units in Vietnam, who couldn't get the adrenaline of killing people out of their systems. And since they were killing non-white people in Vietnam, a certain racism was carried over into the conflict in Rhodesia, later in Zimbabwe. Now, although Mugabe, to an extent, and Nkomo claimed that it was their guerrilla forces that defeated the regime, this is not true. They certainly forced a military stalemate. And it was very, very clear that if they could maintain this stalemate, then just the rate of attrition on a limited white population in which conscription had now become an everyday feature, this attrition would eventually wear down the regime, but at great cost to both sides. So when it was clear that this was going to be a no-win situation, The White Rhodesians, led by Ian Smith, tried to placate international opinion by diplomatic recognition by instituting a cosmetic government purportedly led by a black leader, Abel Muzorewa, a Methodist minister, a church minister, a cleric, and purported to present to the international community a solution to the problems of white minority rule, even though underneath the black cosmetics, they were certainly the ones who were still very, very much in charge. But Margaret Thatcher, who had recently become the Prime Minister of Great Britain, was anxious to cut what she regarded as the Rhodesian albatross from around her neck, and so very, very much wanted to recognize the cosmetic black government. Her Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, was appalled. He knew this would be a ridiculous mistake and basically pleaded for one last throw of the diplomatic dice, and he was aided and abetted in this by both Kenneth Kaunda and also by the Commonwealth Secretary-General, Sridhar Ramphal, probably the most brilliant Commonwealth Secretary-General from Guyana, a brilliant lawyer who had taken his master's degree from King's College down the road from SOAS. And he had a vision of the world in which a combination of idealism and extremely adroit diplomacy, in other words, he was a realist and a diplomatic maneuverer, as well as being an idealist. He had this vision that he could make this combination work. He and Carrington basically hated each other, but Carrington knew that they had to work together. So it was basically those three, Carrington, Kaunda, and Ramphal, who brokered the diplomatic deal that began to be dinted into the heads of the White Rhodesians and also into the South Africans. So the South Africans thought, if this goes on north of our borders and there's eventually a military victory for the guerrilla forces, this is just going to inspire people in our country to take up arms against apartheid. Better that this thing is finally settled peacefully. The Tanzanians and the Zambians worked to persuade the guerrilla leaders to talk peace. And Carrington basically, in concert with the South Africans, told Ian Smith, you better get yourself to the conference that we're about to arrange. So everyone was basically having their arms twisted to come to the conference table. It was actually a conference table set in two parts in Lusaka, Zambia, halfway, well, three-quarters of the way through 1979. Charming act by Kenneth Kaunda as the chairman of that conference, basically wooing Margaret Thatcher, dancing, ballroom dancing the waltz with her. And Ramphal, and I hate to say this because let us say that we've got to recognize these are more gendered days than today, arranged for the most handsome Commonwealth ministers, prime ministers, presidents to pay court on Margaret Thatcher, and they all, together with Carrington, twisted her arm to cooperate. The second phase of these talks were held at Lancaster House towards the end of 1979, Lancaster House here in London. And against all odds, and despite some pretty knife-edge negotiating tactics, sometimes quite heavy-handed, by Lord Carrington, an agreement was reached. The outlawed guerrilla parties would be unoutlawed. They could come in from the cold, come in from the bush. There would be elections at the end of February, March. This would be preceded by almost 3 months of so-called free election campaigning, in which there would be a ceasefire. And basically, I was sent out as one of the Commonwealth observers for that, holding down the operations of the observation for Matabeleland North and Matabeleland South, Joshua Nkomo's heartland, an area the size of England, and having, first of all, conducted the reconnaissance for half of the country before the senior observers arrived. So it was one of those things where you had to prove yourself in a big hurry, There wasn't any time to get anything wrong. You didn't know what you were doing because there had never been an election observation before. Actually, that was the first, and we had no idea what we were doing. Afterwards, we were amazed by the results. Mugabe made one of the great speeches. It ranks with Harold Macmillan's speech to do with the wind of change. He preached reconciliation, and it was accepted. He had been viewed as a red Marxist. The headlines when he came back to address his first rally in Rhodesia after he was unoutlawed, as it were. I was there at the time. The headlines in the white-owned press were, "Here comes the end of Christmas," because they thought that because that was a Christian holiday, Mugabe would surely, as a Marxist, outlaw that. So the volatile situation was not helped by, let us say, fake news, hostile reporting, and even so, despite all kinds of breaches of the ceasefire on both sides, then you had, notwithstanding, a successful campaign in which Mugabe won a much higher percentage of the vote than anyone had predicted. Basically, the British were hoping that a coalition between Joshua Nkomo and Abel Muzorewa would scramble just enough seats to hold a majority in Parliament, and they were unprepared for the sweeping victory of Mugabe. So he became the first Prime Minister, later the President of Zimbabwe, and the first 2 years were calm. Then he undertook a violent military series of pogroms in Joshua Nkomo's heartland, the Matabele lands. Estimates differ between 20 and 80,000, using North Korean trained soldiers, the 5th Brigade, basically to suppress, repress, kill suspected guerrillas from Nkomo's forces who Mugabe thought were plotting to overthrow him. There was very little truth in this suspicion, although the South Africans, in an effort to destabilize the new government, went out of their way to, as I say, foment the possibility that this was happening. The South Africans themselves now basically embarked upon a twin-track strategy of appearing to coexist with the surrounding majority-ruled states, including the new Zimbabwe, while at the same time militarily destabilizing them. In 1982, they blew up the entire Zimbabwean Air Force, for instance, and they conducted different operations using different methodologies, all militarized, against each one of the surrounding states. And I was living in Zambia throughout this time of what they called total strategy. And Zambia got it in the neck as well, but in a different way from Zimbabwe, in a different way from Mozambique, and particularly in a different way from Angola, where basically the South African Army, tanks and all, were there in force and were basically held in check only by the introduction of a Cuban army. So the Cold War really did get hot in Africa at this point in time. Through all of this, and despite covering up largely successfully at first the slaughters in the Matabele land, Mugabe projected himself internationally as a person of peace, as a person of pragmatism, so much so that the 1991 Commonwealth Conference summit meeting held in Harare released the Harare Declaration on Human Rights, and Mugabe was on the stage to help release this. I was in the press gallery immediately below the stage looking up at him, and not a flicker of embarrassment on his face and no twitchiness in his body. We all knew by that stage what had happened in the Matabele lands, but Mugabe was basically, it seemed, without any sense of irony, lecturing the world on what human rights should look like. Later, he even lectured the Chinese on a visit to China on why not have a multi-party state. If you're the strongest party, you can always win the elections, which set into train the whole Mugabe ethos. Basically, he began bullying the elections from 1990 onwards. Now, this is bullying in the first instance, it was not rigging. The rigging actually began in the 2000s, and we'll come to that. But basically, it was almost as if he wanted elections as validation. In other words, they weren't an exercise, a process of choice. They were a process of validation for himself, who had always felt rejected, both by the white minority, of course, in the old Rhodesia, both by the rivals he had to overcome in ZANU, his own party, and also, of course, as time wore on, he had the rivalry from former colleagues, comrades in arms, that greatly embarrassed him. For instance, in the 1990 elections, Edgar Tekere, one of his own comrades in arms, stood against him for the presidency, and that's where the bullying in the electoral process began. He didn't have to do this. Tekere would have lost anyway. He had no party machine for a really effective national campaign. People voted for him as a protest vote, even though, to be very fair to Mugabe, there was very little to protest about at that point in time, unless you came from the Matabele lands, and even then you weren't going to vote for Tekere. What you had was almost this drive that the elections had to be conducted and he had to win. And all of this was while the economy was reasonably vibrant. The economy began to take a nosedive in 1997 when protests by the war veterans saying, hey, look, you've all got now this lifestyle, those of you who were leaders of the liberation, we, the foot soldiers, have gotten nothing, and we would like to have our pensions raised. And the cost of raising the pensions was so high that the value of the Zimbabwean dollar halved on the international exchanges overnight. Coupled with that, at the same time, Mugabe began sending his own soldiers to fight in the terrible meltdown of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the big men of the era of Mobutu were now fading from the scene, and anarchy and militarized chaos had taken their place. Many armies from many African countries fought at that point in time in Democratic Republic of Congo, as it came to be called. The Zimbabwean Army among them, basically the generals were promised they could do some serious looting of the Congolese mineral resources as a reward, and of course this permission also bound them even more tightly to Mugabe. So all kinds of ransack happened, and basically the Zimbabweans played a huge role in making sure that Kabila I became the president of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The South Africans had a greater role in Kabila II, the son, becoming one of the successive presidents. And what's happening in Democratic Republic of Congo now, where there seems to be some completely unforeseen upswing in terms of democratic possibilities, was certainly not occasioned by either the South Africans or the Zimbabweans. But what it meant was that in 1997 you had a decline in Zimbabwean economic possibilities. You also had a couple of other things happening. You had another decline in British economic fortunes as well at that point in time. But you had a second wave of famine sweep Zimbabwe, and this followed the first Great Famine of 1992. Now, I was there at both times, and in fact, I was the one who did the calculations in 1992 before a group of assembled parliamentarians saying, look, you've got 9 days until stock out day. And that's a term which means you've run out of food reserves. You've got to get food into the country. Basically, this meant doing a deal with South Africa. Although Nelson Mandela had been released, Mugabe wasn't keen to do that because there was not yet a black majority rule government. So he absented himself from the country, pleading that he was in mourning because of the death of his wife Sally, the Ghanaian first wife. Joshua Nkomo basically took over briefly and did a deal with the South Africans to bring food into the country. He bought it. He wasn't going to accept charity from what was still, superficially at least, a country underneath apartheid. But it meant also a re-examination in 1992. Why did our farms not weather the famine very, very well? Who owns these farms anyway? And although land was always one of the unspoken issues in the formal talks at Lancaster House in 1979, now the question began to be asked in real earnest. You know, if we'd owned the land, could we have made better provision for a time of emergency? And the answer is probably no, because the land was what brought in the income. It was commercial produce. It wasn't necessarily produce that was designed to provide staples beyond a certain extent. 1997, the issue raised again, and Mugabe asked Tony Blair, the new government leader in Great Britain, at the Commonwealth Summit meeting in Edinburgh of that year, 97, asked him, can you give us some money for land nationalisation? Wanted to basically pay compensation for lands nationalised. And Blair refused in such an insulting way that Mugabe basically hated Blair until the end of his days. The self-righteousness that the British saw quite often was basically felt by Mugabe to be a throwback to the self-righteousness of the white Rhodesian regime. So a form of condescension was what Mugabe felt, and he was therefore determined from that point on to enforce land nationalisation, but didn't do it. He only began doing it in the year 2000 when he faced, for the first time, an electoral challenge from Morgan Tsvangirai. People were beginning to become seriously dissatisfied by the economic decline. Tsvangirai rose up from the trade union movement as an alternative leader and defeated Mugabe in early 2000 in a referendum, the first time Mugabe had actually ever lost in the polls. And within 10 days, he'd launched the farm invasions using the war veterans that had protested against him in 1997. Basically now or never. Basically it was now, and it was never in terms of where is the plan. So the land began to be seized without compensation, basically to win electoral support by the distribution of that land. But the land was distributed in a way that made no commercial sense. The peasant farmers who received small portions of land couldn't farm that commercially. The land portions were too small. Those in the elite, largely government cronies, largely lieutenants of Robert Mugabe, and the inner circle of his party, they received land without, again, having the agronomic education as to how to make best use of it. It became a process of acquisition rather than a process of production. And with the degeneration of land, any of you who know anything about this, it becomes much harder to restore it. In other words, commercial agriculture depends on the regular input of fertilizers, it depends on regular irrigation. Water tables basically have got to be maintained. Dams have got to be built and maintained. And you're basically looking at a serious degeneration of fertilizers are no longer being used because what you've done is to have made the land artificially productive. When it becomes fallow again and it loses this chemical addition, it takes a long time for it to recover any natural state of productivity. And particularly if you begin to over-farm it, because you've only got a small plot and you want to make the most of it as a peasant farmer, then you're taking even more goodness out of the soil for long-term purposes. Neither of the parties, neither Tsvangirai's opposition party nor Mugabe's government party, ever had an agronomist as a Minister of Agriculture. No one knew basically what they were doing. There was never a plan. And when I interviewed Tsvangirai for a book that we wrote together, after he had been charged with treason, and we were helping to prepare him for the 2005 elections as a person of substance, I asked him point blank, who's your agronomist? And he couldn't name anybody who was going to be his agronomic advisor in chief. These are city leaders. As we're legacy of Joshua and Nkomo from the trade union movement, it's not necessarily a trade union movement, but basically it's been government by people who are educated for the cities, political scientists, I regret, lawyers, terrifyingly well-qualified cabinets without scientists, without agronomic scientists, without people with agricultural expertise. But it meant basically the decline from 2000 onwards. This continued right through now 21 years. So you have this desperate state in which the opposition tried to rally. And Mugabe at this stage, basically from round about 2002, could be said to have begun rigging the elections, not on a full scale. That actually happened in 2008, when it became clear in the early stages of the counting that Tsvangirai was going to win. And on the night I was there, I had my polling with him on 56%, enough for a clear victory. Even the conservative estimates of South African broadcasting had him on 52%. Basically, counting suddenly stopped, and the process of after-the-fact rigging that took place over 6 weeks was conducted to ensure that Mugabe stole the elections, and in the runoff that had to follow, he wheeled out so much force and bludgeoning that Tsvangirai basically called off his participation. And this time, the vote was counted overnight, and Mugabe was declared the victor by dirty tactics. And ever since then, let us say that if not rigging outright, then rigging as a recourse of bullying beforehand hadn't worked. All of those have been part of the armory of the Zimbabwean government. And increasingly, as with other African governments, the use of algorithms to electronically distort results, so you don't have to do the manual rigging that took place in 2008. Even so, a coalition government had to be installed after 2008, because even the surrounding states like South Africa were appalled by what had happened. So Tsvangirai, although he should have become president, became prime minister. Mugabe remained president, and it was a very lackluster affair, which all the same, because there was an opposition minister of finance, stabilized the economy by the simple expedient of making the American dollar the national currency. You couldn't print money anymore. But this meant that after the fall of the coalition, in the following elections that took place after 2008, 5 years afterwards, then what you had was very, very much a sense of, well, how do we source the dollars? So what you've got now underneath the government, underneath Mugabe's successor, Emerson Mnangagwa, what you've got is basically a Zimbabwean dollar again, which is very little value, and basically it's to a certain extent print on demand, which basically again leads to inflation, not yet as bad as the hyperinflation that took place underneath Mugabe's regime. At one stage, if you tried to measure out the number of zeros, I had it on 23 rows of zeros. It was surreal. You walked into a restaurant with a toiletry bag full of notes. It was counted by a Chinese machine, and the price of the menu had risen while you were eating. Still not as bad as in Uganda after the fall of Famine, when we were carrying suitcases of worthless notes. But by the time of the end of this hyperinflationary regime, with the beginning of the use of the American dollar, we were at least using satchels of notes in Zimbabwe. Are we going to get to that point again? Well, there seems to be no productive value in the Zimbabwean economy. It's cheaper to import a bottle of cooking oil than to manufacture it in Zimbabwe. In other words, inputs to just the basic machinery that you need to press and to bottle cooking oil is something which has not been maintained. The economy is one of acquisition. It's not one of production. It's not one of circulating money, because that which is corruptly stolen is basically expatriated into accounts overseas and not recycled for, let us say, internal use, and the kind of untoward but sometimes beneficial internal productive use. And there's still no evidence that people understand modern commercial farming, and even if they did, when you lose your markets, the neighboring countries like the Zambians have snapped up those markets. Your strawberries come from Zambia. Okay, so what you have there is a ruthless environment in which it's unlikely that the Zimbabweans will recoup their former markets. They're turning now to mining platinum, but again, what kind of capacity to refine the platinum? In other words, is it going to be acquisitiveness as opposed to development of a proper sector? We take the case of the South Africans, where they also have rich platinum deposits. You mine the platinum, you refine the platinum, and you build the platinum into catalytic converters for attachment to car exhausts, and you assemble the cars because you've got car assembly plants. It's all done in South Africa. Almost every single BMW 3 Series car that's driven in North America was actually assembled in this way in South Africa. They think they're driving a German car. Well, it is, but it's made under license essentially in South Africa. Now, the Zimbabweans have got none of this beneficiation chain, and no one's thought to try to develop beneficiation, a manufacturing chain. So what you've got is really a parlous state in which certainly there's been no technocratic thought, which, of course, returns us to the lead question here. What was thoughtful about Mugabe? Was simply fixation on the land thoughtful? Was this a thoughtfulness which was antique, antiquarian? Or was there something in it? Well, there was something in it. Scholars, Western scholars like Terence Ranger, David Lan, wrote much about the spiritual qualities of the land in Zimbabwe. Now, you've got to take this with a grain of salt. You certainly can't deny that this was the case. And other scholars like Norma Krieger have pointed out that there were many things that you should put into the basket of considerations, one of which, certainly, the spiritual value of the land, but other factors as well. And in fact, the Zimbabwean scholar Billy Mukamuri, whose PhD I examined at the University of Tampere in Finland, made the point that this spiritual value could be something that was harnessed by charlatans pretending to be shamans, able to access the spirits of the land and the underworld in which the spirits lived, and could be used for personal gain as much as for spiritual value per se. Even so, it's quite clear that spirit possession, the rituals of shamans who are able to call upon ancestors and upon the spirits of the land, this is a real phenomenon, particularly in the rural areas of Zimbabwe. Does this mean that you have a liberation movement predicated only on this value in the land or on other things as well? So I remember during the ceasefire of 1980, and I think I've said to you that one of my roles was liaison with the officers of the various armies. This meant 5 armies by that stage. And I would be talking to the young colonels from the liberation forces and basically say, what did you fight for? And they always led off with dignity and democracy. Only when I pressed them would they say land. And so there were affairs of the spirit of the heart, of the dignity of the self, as well as the spirit of the land. Now, this has been fetishized by Mugabe leadership, which in himself as a person, Mugabe, he was Jesuit educated, he could do Latin. He never worked the land, just like as a nationalist leader, even directing a military campaign, he never actually held a gun. This was all to a certain extent theoretical, and the young people who went to their deaths in the early experiments in terms of military strategy and tactics, and they meant nothing to a ruthless person, which clearly is what Mugabe either was or became. He was one of these people who had a certain sense of posterity, which did endear him to people outside Zimbabwe, and he still has a base of support in Zimbabwe itself, because there are still people who think that what he did in terms of the land basically was a validation of themselves as Zimbabweans. Ownership is a validation of nationalism. Nationalization becomes a validation of nationalism. Not just political rights, but economic rights. But economic rights is vested only in ownership as opposed to production of the land is not a complete ownership of what land can do and should do in the modern age. Even so, this idea of ownership as the key ingredient in terms of a nationalist agenda has spread. And he stood up to the white man, did he not only in terms of the white minority government of Ian Smith, but the white farmers, who for the most part were the owners of the commercial lands. And to be fair, again, a vast disproportion of these commercial lands were in white ownership. The best lands, I hasten to add. So that at the great wake for Nelson Mandela, held in the Soweto Football Stadium, one of the great stadiums built for the Football World Cup. What you had was Jacob Zuma as the president being booed by a gigantic stadium full of South Africans, and when Robert Mugabe came to pay his respects, he was cheered to the very, very rafters of this great stadium. In other words, as a symbol of nationalist leadership, it evoked admiration. Still, where is the presence of thought, as opposed to simply an appeal to nostalgia, an appeal to romanticism, an appeal to those things which in some ways are thoughtful in a poetic way, but certainly not in an economic way, and certainly not in a technocratic way, and certainly not in an agronomic way. Was Mugabe a product of his times? Well, the product lives after him, because you still have his generation in power. You still have the heroes, quote unquote, of liberation holding power. You right now have, as it were, a certain weaning out of these heroes of liberation. They've all been dying of COVID, and this, of course, speaks to the degeneration of the health sector. No one's been prepared to invest in it. And of course, in COVID, you can't fly off anywhere for expensive medical treatment, as Mugabe used to do, Singapore being a favored destination. So they've been trapped in Zimbabwe, and they've had to die. And 4 cabinet ministers have so far died of COVID. The Sinopharm vaccine has only just now this week reached Zimbabwe. I'm just watching it being snapped up by the elite, as opposed to going to the front line health workers and to ordinary people. So you have a degeneration not just of the agricultural sector, but of all other sectors, the health sector being key among them. And of course, you counterpose that with yesterday's news from Cuba. Don't forget, it was Cuban armies that held back the South Africans and defended Angola. And by defeating the South African apartheid army in 1988 at the Battle of Quitaquala Valley in southern Angola, basically broke the back of the apartheid government, allowed the ascension to power of the moderate F.W. de Klerk, who immediately began holding talks with Kenneth Kaunda. And a short time after those talks, late 89 and early 1990, released Nelson Mandela. Trace all that back to the Cubans and their solidarity. But if you look at what Fidel did, and he would probably have done much more had it not been for American sanctions, even despite the hardest times in Cuba, he prioritized health and scientific development. That country actually published about 200 scientific journals. It was crazy. So they're inventing their own vaccine, and I don't doubt that they can do this. Fidel was a guerrilla leader who proposed great thoughtfulness into what his country needed and sent out doctors to help many other countries, including African countries. He had the doctors. His country probably has the means to develop at least a working vaccine as viable as that of the Sinopharm and the Sputnik, a variety. Country with the advantages that Rhodesia had as it turned into Zimbabwe. Could they have gone down a route like that, prioritizing health and scientific development, particularly with the proximity of scientific partners in South Africa after it cast off the yoke of apartheid? All kinds of possibilities were possible underneath a thoughtful regime. Thoughtfulness to do with how nationalism is completed, yes. The technocratic means by which this can be made beneficial, no. The symbol of opposition to white rule, right down to the bitter end, even with the continual use of effigies, as it were, of Tony Blair. Certainly that symbolism was there. Outdated in a new world where there are problems with the Chinese, for instance, who are not precisely white, I hasten to add, and who suffered their own century of humiliation at the hands of imperial and colonial powers. How to face a new world underneath conditions of thought that establish only a binary of white and black. All kinds of questions asked about this man, who all the same can be said to have been a figure who broke the back of the second to last bastion of white minority rule in southern Africa, followed only by South Africa as the last project to be accomplished in this manner. And this next week that we'll talk about South Africa, the thought of Nelson Mandela, moral thought certainly in terms of the rainbow bridge that he provided out of the terrible divisions of apartheid, but the technocratic bridge that his successor Thabo Mbeki tried to build, and the reinvention by Mbeki of an African Renaissance, a Pan-Africa based on culture, making him the last in a long line of Pan-Africanists from the days of the 1945 Manchester Congress to this day, from people like Kwame Nkrumah, reaching back before him to people like Webb Du Bois, down to the present day. It had been Mbeki. How does their thought, since they also had to struggle against white minority rule, how does their thought differ from Robert Mugabe? So these two lectures, the one next week on Mandela and Mbeki, and this week's one on Mugabe, go together by way of providing contrasting positions. Mugabe will have written about him since the very beginning. I was at one stage very fearful that he might outlive me. That seemed to me very unjust at one stage. It seemed that he refused to consent to die. I used to curse my Singaporean counterparts at the hospitals there, providing him with all kinds of miraculous treatments. But he has now since passed into history. The first phase of that historical judgment is not a kind one. At the same time, it should not be a one-dimensional one. In terms of the search for dimensionality, in terms of the life, the career, the liberation and the thoughtfulness of Robert Mugabe, then one must be fair and say that to some extent at least, the jury is still out. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.